Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be reading from this little book right here. This volume that I hold in my hands is nearly 100 years old. It was published in 1926, but the novel that it contains is older still. You can't really see it from the faded embossing on the cover, but this book is a copy of Silas Marner by George Eliot. The book was originally written and published in 1861, and for those of you who don't know George Eliot, you might have been a little confused at the portrait of the author at the beginning of this book. As you may have guessed by now, George Eliot was a pen name. I thought it would be fun, rather than diving directly into the story, to start this series on Silas Marner with the introduction to this book, which includes a biographical sketch by Edward L. Gulick, the master, it says here, of English in the Lawrenceville School in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. He wrote the introduction to this book for its 1926 Macmillan publishing, which is the book that I hold here in my hands today. And as George Eliot is, sadly, not as well known as some of her contemporaries, I think it would be nice for all of us to brush up a little bit on her life so that we can better appreciate her contributions. I hope that sounds good to you too. Let's begin with the biographical sketch. It starts November 22nd, 1819. Mary Ann Evans was born at Arbury Farm at 5 o'clock this morning. With this entry in his diary, Mr. Robert Evans recorded the birth of a daughter who was to become known to the world as George Eliot. A glance at what is known of her parents will reveal the sources of many traits of her mind and character. The lines of her father's face, as shown in a portrait, to be found in Cross's Life of George Eliot, confirm what we read of his strength, seriousness, and sternness of character. His occupation was that of a land agent, a responsible and respectable business, in which his physical strength, practical knowledge, and sagacity made him unique among land agents. His second wife, the mother of Mary Ann, was, at the time of her marriage, of a somewhat higher social station than her husband. She was a woman with an unusual amount of natural force, a shrewd, practical person, with a considerable dash of the Mrs. Poyser in her. Hers was an affectionate, warm-hearted nature, and her children, on whom she cast the benediction of her gaze, were thoroughly attached to her. Shortly after her last child's birth, she became ailing in health. The year 1819, to quote again from Mr. Cross, is memorable as a culminating period of bad times and political discontent in England. The nation was suffering acutely from the reaction after the excitement of the last Napoleonic War. George IV did not come to the throne till January 1820, so that George Eliot was born in the reign of George III. Waterloo was not yet an affair of 5 years old. Byron had 4 years, and Goethe had 13 years still to live. The last of Miss Austen's novels had been published only 18 months, and the first of the Waverley series only 6 years before. Thackeray and Dickens were boys at school, and George Sand was a girl of 15. That so-called Greater Britain, Canada and Australia, which today forms so large a reading public, was then scarcely more than a geographical expression, with less than 500,000 inhabitants all told, where at present there are 8 millions. And in the United States, where more copies of George Eliot's books are now sold than in any other quarter of the world, the population then numbered less than 10 millions, where today it is 55 millions. Including Great Britain, these English-speaking races have increased from 30 millions in 1820 to 100 millions in 1884, and with a corresponding increase in education, we can form some conception how a popular English writer's fame has widened its circle. There was a remoteness about a detached country house in the England of those days, difficult for us to conceive now with our railways, penny posts and telegraphs. Nor is the Warwickshire county about Griff an exhilarating surrounding. There are neither hills nor vales, no rivers, lakes, or sea, nothing but a monotonous succession of green fields and hedgerows, with some fine trees. The only water to be seen is the Brown Canal. The effect of such a landscape on an ordinary observer is not inspiring. But effective magic is transcendent nature, and with her transcendent nature, George Eliot has transfigured these scenes, dear to Midland souls, into many an idyllic picture, known to those who know her books. In her childhood, the great event of the day was the passing of the coach before the gate of Griff House, which lies at a bend of the high road between Coventry and Nuneaton, and within a couple of miles of the mining village of Bedworth, where the land began to be blackened with coal pits, the rattle of hand looms to be heard in hamlets and villages. Here were powerful men walking queerly, with knees bent outward from squatting in the mine, going home to throw themselves down in their blackened flannel and sleep through the daylight, then rise and spend much of their high wages at the alehouse with their fellows of the benefit club. Here the pale, eager faces of hand-loom weavers, men and women, haggard from sitting up late at night to finish the week's work, hardly begun till Wednesday. Everywhere the cottages and the small children were dirty, for the languid mothers gave their strength to the loom. Pious, dissenting women, perhaps, who took life patiently and thought that salvation depended chiefly on predestination and not at all on cleanliness. Such were the parents of Mary Ann Evans, and such the time and place of her early life. But these commonplace elements were transmuted by the magic of her genius into the gold of her art. Of Mary Ann herself, we are told that though she very early acquired the notion that she was to be a personage in the world, she was not a precocious child. Her slowness in learning to read was not, however, due to any slowness of apprehension, but rather to her intense fondness for playing with her brother Isaac. With him grew up a delightful comradeship, charmingly described in her Sonnets on Childhood. In her moral development, she showed from the earliest years the trait that was most marked in her all through life, namely, the absolute need of some one person who should be all in all to her, and to whom she should be all in all. Very jealous in her affections, and easily moved to smiles or tears, she was of a nature capable of the keenest enjoyment and the keenest suffering, knowing all the wealth and all the woe of a preeminently exclusive disposition. She was affectionate, proud, and sensitive to the highest degree. This early character is worth considering, for what she was as a child, that she continued to be through a life that brought maturity resulting from expansion and experience. Such a richly endowed nature was a treasury from which the future novelist could draw at will. But an internal treasure house needs to be stored with external experience. Contact with varied and active forms of life Mary Ann had from her association with her brother and father. The unconscious education of farm life, the romping play with a brother in the barns, over the fields, and in the woods, the association with her father in his superintendence of the labourers, all these gave to Mary Ann a close view of real life, a grasp on its stern facts, and a knowledge of its details, its picturesque aspects, and its types of pleasant character. Her father's business, moreover, gave him a social station, midway between that of the farmers and that of the gentry whose estates he managed. This social contact gave the needed aspiration and stimulus. From her 8th or 9th year, when she was sent to Miss Wallington's school at Nuneaton, began that habit of reading which stored her mind with the treasures of literature. Waverley, Defoe's History of the Devil, Pilgrim's Progress, and Johnson's Rasselas were among her early favourites. At this school, the religious side of her nature was developed to a remarkable degree. Miss Lewis, her teacher and lifelong friend, was an ardent evangelical churchwoman, and exerted a strong influence on her young pupil, whom she found sympathetically inclined. In her 13th year, she was sent to Coventry to a Miss Franklin's school, where her religious activity was increased. Here also she learned to play the piano skilfully. The death of her mother and the marriage of her eldest sister threw the entire care of the household upon Marianne, as she now called herself, who became a most exemplary housewife. Relief from the drudgery of housekeeping was attained when, in 1841, her father moved to Coventry, an important change to Miss Evans, for it brought her under the influence of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Bray and Miss Sarah Hennell, and led to the well-known change in her religious opinions. She marked her abandonment of theistic belief by the publication of her translation of Strauss's Leben Jesu. From this time till her death, the account of her doings includes an enormous amount of reading, study, letter-writing, and travel. After her father's death in 1849, she went abroad with Mr. and Mrs. Bray, and spent nearly a year at Geneva. After her return, she received and accepted an invitation to become assistant editor of the Westminster Review. Her residence in London broadened her horizon, and gave her an acquaintance with such persons as Herbert Spencer, with whom she had an unbroken friendship, Harriet Martineau, Huxley, and Mr. George H. Lewis, with whom acquaintance was followed by admiration and love, ending in 1854 with her becoming Mrs. Lewis. If there is, she writes to Mrs. Bray, any one action or relation of my life which is and always has been profoundly serious, it is my relation with Mr. Lewis. After spending 2 years in Germany, she began, at the suggestion of her husband, the experiment of writing a story. Amos Barton, followed by Mr. Gilfil's love story and Janet's repentance, as a series called Scenes from Clerical Life, proved her power in narrative, humour, and pathos. It is interesting to know that Charles Dickens was the first to detect the delicacy of a woman's touch beneath the disguise of the masculine pseudonym. Having discovered her extraordinary gift as a story writer, and encouraged both by her husband and by the favour with which the scenes had been received, George Eliot published a novel entitled Adam Bede. Thus, in 1858 began a series of works that appeared at intervals of from 1 to 3 years, including, besides the two already mentioned, The Mill on the Floss, Silas Marner, Romola, Felix Holt, Middlemarch, and closing in 1876 with Daniel Deronda. After the appearance of Adam Bede, of which 16,000 copies were sold in 1 year, George Eliot's fame was assured. Letters of appreciation came from Charles Dickens, Charles Reade, and other distinguished persons. The witty sayings of Mrs. Poyser were universally admired, and one, in particular, was said to have been quoted in Parliament. The Mill on the Floss extended her fame and won the admiration of the Queen. For the scenes of all but 2 of her novels, George Eliot turned to Middle England, in which 30 years of her life had been passed, and to the persons best known to her. One gains much interest, consequently, by recognizing the autobiographical features of the first half of The Mill on the Floss, by seeing the sterling qualities of her father in Caleb Garth and Adam Bede, by finding in Mrs. Poyser the efficiency and caustic wit of her mother, and the evangelical fervour of her aunt Samuel in Dinah Morris. The closing years of George Eliot's life were filled with her manifold reading and studying and writing, carried on with enormous power of sustained work, limited only by her delicate health and the necessary visits to the continent. These years were enriched by the friendships of many admirers, and while she was still living, she was recognized as among the greatest writers of fiction. She is described by Matilda Blind as a frail-looking woman who would sit with her chair drawn close to the fire, and whose winning womanliness of bearing and manner struck everyone who had the privilege of an introduction to her. Her long, pale face, with its strongly marked features, was less rugged in the mature prime of life than in youth, the inner meanings of her nature having worked themselves more and more to the surface. Her abundant hair, untinged with grey, whose smooth bands made a kind of frame for the face, was covered by a lace or muslin cap, with lappets of rich point or Valenciennes lace fastened under her chin. Her grey-blue eyes, under noticeable eyelashes, expressed the same acute sensitiveness as her long, thin, beautifully shaped hands. She had a pleasant laugh and smile, her voice being low, distinct, and intensely sympathetic in quality. Though her conversation was perfectly easy, each sentence was as finished, as perfectly formed, as the style of her published works. Such was her appearance as she met her guests at the famous Sunday afternoon receptions at the Priory at Whitley. Here were gathered a brilliant group of writers and conversers, among whom occasionally were Tennyson, Browning, and Thackeray, who with scores of others came to converse with her and her husband. To the help of Mr. Lewis, she felt herself largely indebted, for he had relieved her of all care in business matters, and had furnished the initial suggestion and the constant criticism which she needed as an author, and also the sympathy and support which she needed as a woman, particularly during her frequent times of depression. After his death in 1878, she secluded herself for many weeks, denying herself even to her friends, and devoting herself to work upon his writings. 2 years later, she was married to Mr. J. W. Cross, a family friend and admirer, who after her death in 1880 made with faultless good taste a compilation of her letters, by which we are admitted into her private correspondence and are permitted to read her life largely in her own words. Her own words, too, we may quote, to crown this brief account of her life, recognizing that the years are realizing a fulfillment of her aspiration found in her best and best known poem. Oh, may I join the choir invisible of those immortal dead who live again, in minds made better by their presence live, in pulses stirred to generosity, in deeds of daring rectitude in scorn, for miserable aims that end with self, in thoughts sublime that pierce the night like stars, and with the mild persistence urge man's search to vaster issues. This is life to come, which martyred men have made more glorious for us who strive to follow. May I reach that purest heaven to be other souls, the cup of strength in some great agony, enkindle generous ardour, feed pure love, beget the smiles that have no cruelty, be the sweet presence of a good diffused, and in diffusion ever more intense. So shall I join the choir invisible, whose music is the gladness of the world. And that, my friends, is where we'll end today's reading. I hope that when we begin the story proper of Silas Marner, that this brief overview and sketch of the life and person of the author will help us to get a better sense of her from beyond a century and beyond the page. Thank you all for joining me today. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and until next we meet, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.